The views or opinions expressed on Ann Arbor Inclusive do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the City of Ann Arbor and the Commission on Disability Issues. For more information about the Ann Arbor Commission on Disability Issues, please visit a2gov.org/disability resources.
Hello everyone and welcome to Ann Arbor Inclusive. I'm Zach Damon. We have a wonderful show for you today as longtime community member Roger Chard joins us in studio. Well, Roger, thank you so much for sitting down with me, and how are you today?
I'm fine. You're quite welcome.
Oh, thank you. Well, let's jump right into it, shall we? So, you worked as a lawyer in real estate law for 38 years and retired in 2010. Is retirement everything you hoped it would be?
I didn't go into retirement with a lot of big or strong preconceived notions as to what retirement would be. I thought it would be a little easier than the workaday world, and it has been, although I've stayed busy. I'd say the principal developments in the last 5 years have been getting rid of the pressure of the daily grind and the daily need to be an advocate for someone or constantly negotiating something. I've been able to read a lot more of what I want to read. I've always been a voracious reader, but now I can choose what I read a little more than when I was in practice and when cases dictated what I had to read. So that's allowed for more time to do other things that I want to do also, to travel, to, in general, have more spontaneity about anything that comes up. So for example, if there's a trip or a conference that I want to attend or be away for a longer period than I typically would have been when I was in practice, I can do that now, and there's not as much keeping me from doing it as there was when I was in practice. So yes, I'd say yes, retirement's been fine, and it has been what I'd hoped it would be.
That's great. I mean, seems like you have a little bit more freedom now. And speaking of traveling, I read recently that you had taken an expedition a couple of years ago to Antarctica. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
That was a mighty big trip. We went from Detroit to Atlanta, and then from Atlanta on to Buenos Aires, and that's where we joined the trip, and chartered from Buenos Aires on down to the bottom of Argentina to a town called Ushuaia, and that's where we picked up the ship. And this was not a cruise where you're on a ship with 5,000 people and they have to get you somewhere so that you can get off at certain times so that you can shop or things like that. Mm-hmm. First of all, there's not a lot of shopping in Antarctica, but this was a trip of 148 passengers.
Wow.
And we left Ushuaia and just went on down as far as we could until we ran into the ice, and that was the extent of how far our trip went. Mm. We were able to get off the boat almost every day in one way or another to go onto islands and visit some of the working stations of the United States, primarily, scientific working stations. And then when we got down to the ultimate ice pack, we got right out on the ice and walked all over it and also onto adjoining islands, walking among the penguins, taking zodiacs out and around amongst the seals, amongst the whales. The trip was a partnership between Lindblad Expeditions and National Geographic.
Oh, wow.
So the trip was actually a working trip for the people from National Geographic, and their divers, their photographers, their naturalists were on board, and also delivering lectures on board, usually twice a day. So that was the educational part of it. Marita Holland, who has been my longtime musical accompanist and my life partner now, and I took this trip together. And one of the highlights for us was we got a chance to perform a musical recital on board one of the evenings while we were traveling. So
yeah,
it was a great trip. Lasted
wow.
about 2 weeks, and it was a wonderful adventure. And we'd do it again. In fact, we are planning to do something again with the same companies. This time it will be a trip up the Atlantic next year, going back to Ushuaia, Argentina. And this time, instead of going down to Antarctica, we'll be headed up the Atlantic all the way to Germany, and that will take the better part of a month.
Wow, so you are just amazing. Now, that is so amazing that you were on this trip and got to meet some National Geographic divers and some staff, even hear some lectures, but then you did this performance on board. Now, how did everyone like that? Was it a positive reaction? Did they enjoy it?
Yes, the reaction was very good. We had brought along music for a lot of sea songs, and so we made this into a little recital of sea songs that were relevant to what we were doing at the time.
I think that's great, and the fact that they enjoyed that and the fact that you got a positive response, that must have felt great.
We were lucky that it happened to be a day when the ship was relatively stable. We weren't going through Drake's Passage or something like that and trying to just keep our feet.
Yeah. Well, aside from being a respected lawyer and a world traveler, you're also an accomplished baritone who sang for 15 years with the Ann Arbor Cantata Singers, with the Men's Glee Club at Michigan State, and also sang at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and including 2 Hill Auditorium appearances with the legend himself, Dave Brubeck. So, having performed at numerous large venues, do you ever get nervous before a performance?
Absolutely. I get nervous before every performance. And that extends not just to music, but that was always true in law practice too. Before a trial or before a big court argument, there was always a level of nervousness. That goes all the way back, in fact, to my high school music performances, to my high school and college debating at Lansing Sexton High School, the Michigan School for the Blind, and also to Michigan State University. A certain level of nervousness is actually good. You hear stories about athletes who have tremendous levels of nervousness before games. It's a way of drawing yourself into focus for what you're doing. I never reached quite the level that some athletes do, where they're literally sick before going onto the court or onto the field. There is some level of nervousness that I think does actually help if you know how to handle it, know what to expect of yourself. And eventually, you don't shed the nervousness, but you understand it. You know what to expect of yourself. But it also means that you don't take anything for granted. I know you were a wrestler in high school. You wrestled with my son.
That's right.
My son attended a summer wrestling camp at the University of Minnesota, and there was a little sign in the coach's office who ran that camp, and it had great wisdom. It said, "Assume nothing." And that was always a great operating bit of advice for me, and I think should be for a lot of people. So when you go to perform, or when you go to do a trial, you have to be as prepared as you possibly can. You have to recognize when you've reached the level of preparedness that you can for what you're about to do. But you can't take anything for granted. You can't just assume that things are going to go necessarily the way you want them to go. And so that little bit of nervousness helps you appreciate that, I think.
So would it be accurate to say then that you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that might be a good way to put it. Morita could tell you that there have been a number of times before a recital that you've practiced and practiced and practiced, and you know that there are still things you could do that would make things better, and yet you also understand that you have to reach a point where you say, this is as good as it's going to be this time. You can't continue to tinker and tinker right up to the time that you're trying to perform. You can't be constantly trying to add little interpretations or change things at the last minute. Otherwise, you'll end up being indecisive and probably mess things up. You have to at least at the time you're going to do the performance or do the argument or whatever it is you're going to do, you have to have a pretty good idea of how it is you're going to do it, at least at that time. If you do the same performance a year later, you might do things very differently, but you have to reach a point at which you say, this is as good as it's going to get this time.
So growing up, your father was the musical director at the Residential Michigan School for the Blind. So you talked about singing earlier, but can you talk about performing and the role music has played in your life?
I didn't start studying voice until after I graduated from college. I did sing in choirs. I sang in the Michigan State Men's Glee Club, for example, for 3 years. And I sang in high school choruses and church choirs and that sort of thing. But I didn't actually take a formal voice lesson until I had graduated from Michigan State. I studied French horn for 7 years, and I studied piano for 12, and played a few other instruments like the tuba. But my dad was a band man. He always encouraged me to sing, but during school, elementary and high school, I was an instrumentalist. And so I played in bands and orchestras and did the usual solo and ensemble festivals that high school students do. But along the way, my dad taught me how to practice, how to prepare. And from there, I think I learned a lot about concentration and bringing yourself to focus on a particular project. And if you think about it, music allows you or causes you to concentrate, forces you to concentrate on something that is what you're trying to do at the moment. But that broadens out to other things. So when you get out and you're working, if you're not a musician necessarily, you're practicing law, for instance, or maybe practicing medicine, you bring those concentration skills that you learned or hopefully learned along the way and can apply them in other areas. So I think there was a huge influence of music throughout my entire life, and even though what it may influence is not necessarily a musical project at a given moment, nonetheless there's what I learned from music in the background, and not necessarily too far in the background either.
I think you bring up a great point. I mean, from my own perspective, you know, I think having a disability, it makes us have that discipline, that focus to where, no, if we're not going to get this right, we're going to go back and try it and do it again. And I think you understand that. You know, you understand that dedication, that discipline, and that drive to get something right, but also do something well.
Well, my father was also blind, and his attitude was that if you're blind, you have to do things twice as well as your sighted compatriot in order to be taken seriously, or for people to understand that you also can do what other people can do. But the idea is along the right lines. You have to understand that, for starters at least, probably a predisposition is going to be that you aren't as likely to be able to do something as someone else who doesn't have the disability can do it. And so you have to try harder, prepare more, whatever you want to call it. And so that's the background that I came up in.
Well, talking about that focus and that effort, can you talk about when you attended the University of Michigan Law School and some of the challenges you faced while in law school and sort of how you adapted to that?
Well, law school was a challenge for me. I freely admit that. That was back in the late 60s and early 70s. It was well before the kind of adaptive technology that we have today. So I didn't have a scanner, for example, of the sort that I have now and have had for the last 25 or 30 years that would allow me to take a piece of print and lay it on the lens of the machine and have it convert that print into speech. I didn't have compressed speech capabilities. And by compressed speech, I mean the ability to play something on a tape recorder and have that speech increased in speed but not have it increased in pitch. So when I went through college and law school, if I wanted to read something faster than the reader was reading it to me on tape, I would have to turn the speed up, but that also meant turning the pitch up. In those days, I got a lot of teasing about reading like Donald Duck because the speech was so much faster but also so much higher than typical speech rates. Compressed speech was a feature that was just beginning to come along in the early 70s. I saw an ad for a compressed speech cassette machine, and I thought, gee, this would be a wonderful thing. I'll go out and get one, until I found out that it cost $4,000.
Oh, wow.
And so I didn't do it right away. We also would be using manual typewriters at that time, and so I could type something, but if I was composing at the keyboard, I might forget what I had written last, or I wouldn't be sure that what I had just typed had necessarily all gotten onto the line. That's not such a big problem in a lot of circumstances, but if you're trying to type an exam, that's a problem. So those were some of the challenges. Plus in law, cases are always changing, new opinions are always coming down, statutes are being amended. And so even if someone has, some organization, for example, has recorded a law textbook, and you are pretty happy that you're going to have that to work with, it's stunning to get to class and realize that they've just moved on to the next edition. And so what you have is not going to be used, even though it's beautiful and sitting there ready for you to take one tape or one cassette and use it. Suddenly you don't have that ability. So in those days I relied principally on people who read directly to me or who recorded things for me on tape, and that's how I got my work done both in college as well as in law school, and it meant constantly being behind. Now, I don't mean to suggest that if I'd had all the wonderful adaptive equipment that I have now, I necessarily would have been fully up to speed. I was, after all, a student and I was a kid, and so I probably would have been behind anyway. But I probably wouldn't have been as far behind.
I'm curious to know briefly, I mean, because going into law school, you probably knew that it was going to be a challenge for you. So what attracted you to law?
Well, that's an interesting question, one that I've never satisfactorily answered, I think. I went to college and debated as to whether I was going to be a music major or major in something else. I finally decided that making it in music was probably going to be just too difficult unless I entertained the notion that I was going to be at the very top levels of music, which I didn't think I would be. And so I finally opted to go into something which would prepare me to be able to do one of two things, either to teach or to go on to law school. So I majored in political science, history, and sociology, and actually was going to teach. And I had done all of my education courses and was down to student teaching. And then I got into a little bit of a fight with the education department. That was at a time when we were going through a bit of a crisis in education. It seems like we go through a lot of those.
Yeah.
But at that time, if you had a fairly high grade point in college, there was almost a belittling of your accomplishment, whereas if you had grades that were sort of in the average range, somehow that was more endorsed than if you had performed well. You may remember back, it was at around that time, the early 70s, that President Nixon nominated a couple of people to the U.S. Supreme Court who were attacked because they weren't especially scholarly. And some senators actually got up on the floor of the U.S. Senate and said we needed to have somebody on the court who looked out for the C student or who looked out for the average guy. And so that was the kind of thing that was going on at that time. The other thing that happened with me is that I got a lot of pushback on going into teaching. People in the education department of my school said it wasn't such a good idea, that it was difficult for a blind person to teach, gave me a lot of bromides about how difficult it would be, how much hard time we would have controlling people in the classrooms, so on and so on. Not realizing that my father was a blind teacher and that the very same arguments had been used against him in 1939.
Right. Wow.
So finally, I got tired of it and said, well, I do have another option. It was a tough choice because I knew that if my student teaching went well, that I actually had a job waiting for me, particularly if I agreed in the school district in consideration, particularly if I agreed to coach debate at one of the schools. But I finally pulled out and I said, well, I don't have to do this. I have another option. I can go on to law school. Law school, courtrooms were something I'd always been fascinated with. I had debated for 8 years in high school and college, enjoyed a fair amount of success. And so I opted out of the teaching direction and went on to law school, was accepted at the University of Michigan Law School, and came here, went to school, and got a job after that, and ended up staying in Ann Arbor, and that's how it happened. It's not necessarily a great explanation as to why I did it or how I did it, but it has a lot to do with why I did it.
So shifting back really quick, you're an avid skier and were named Athlete of the Year in 2004 by the National Sports Center for the Disabled in Winter Park, Colorado. So really quick, for those that don't know, how can an unsighted person ski downhill?
Well, the best answer to that is that, at least at the National Sports Center, a blind person skis in front of a guide, a sighted guide, who is calling out to you turn commands. So as you're coming down, they will clue you in as to turning left, turning right. If you get better, you can reach a point where if this hill is open enough in terms of its size and in terms of not having so many people on it, you can be allowed to ski free. And then if you do get a little bit to one side or the other, they'll come back in with their commands and center you up. But probably I know I find it nicer to ski without commands than with them, because you can develop your own rhythm coming down a hill rather than trying to anticipate the rhythm of what your guide is going to call. Now, if you work with the same person for a number of years, then you do develop a kind of rapport so that isn't as big an issue.
Sure.
But that's the technical way that it happens. You ski with a sighted guide, and generally speaking, they ski behind you. There are some times where a person who has partial vision wants to try to take advantage of that vision, and so maybe the guide skis in front. But I know whenever I've done it, the guide skis behind.
All right. Wonderful. Well, and then lastly, you continue to challenge yourself and set goals. So very briefly, what advice do you have for others on how to reach your personal life goals?
Well, I've never regarded myself as a Dr. Phil type or anything like that, so I don't know that I have any overarching goals, but I guess what I would say is that whatever you're going to do, try to do it as fully and as passionately as you can. I think if you do something to the fullest extent that you can do it, that's when it becomes fun to do it. So for instance, if you're playing even something like a game of cards, if you know the rules well and you play enough and you play it so that you can play it well, it's a lot more fun than just casually playing and constantly making the same mistakes.
Right.
I think it's good to try to improve, to try to do as well as you can with whatever it is you're doing, and not to constantly think about why it is that you can't do it. A professor of mine in college used to say something that I thought was quite interesting, and I've tried to remember it over the years. He said, if you're reading a book, for example, try to read it sympathetically at first before you start to criticize it. And that applies more broadly than just to reading. So if you read it sympathetically, get as many ideas as you can from what the author is saying, then after you've finished it up, you can start to think about, well, maybe this wasn't quite so, or maybe somebody else has said something that's different, and let's try to square those opinions up. But keep your mind as open as you can when you are undertaking to do something, and get as much positive information about how to do it as you can, and then begin to analyze those things and work them into how you're actually going to go about doing a particular thing for yourself. And I had a vocal coach once who, when we were trying to figure out how best to do a particular set of poetry and how best to interpret it, he agreed with me that you could interpret it in a couple of different ways, and it would be perfectly legitimate to do it either way. But ultimately, he said to me, sometimes you just have to take a point of view.
I love that.
And I have found that little bit of wisdom to be very valuable, not just in singing, but in a lot of other phases, such as reading a court case and saying, what is it that they're trying to say? And after a while, and thinking about it, and thinking about a variety of different interpretations that might be possible, you do have to just take a point of view. And I think that's maybe one of the best bits of advice I've ever received, and I've passed it along to many.
Thank you, Roger. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank Roger Chard for joining me in studio, and hope that you can tune into Ann Arbor Inclusive next month. Stay awesome, Ann Arbor.